Hello, this is Dr. Peter Hancock. I am extremely honored to present the keynote speech at the International Ergonomics Association at the virtual meeting. And this topic will be on trust in automation and autonomy. I will be covering topics that are of interest, I believe, to many right now. To give you an idea of how I'm going to present today, I'm going to give you the four areas. First, I'm going to begin with a link and a lesson. And this comes from an earlier presentation, and I'd like to be able to draw a lesson from that presentation. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the essence of the problem itself. Thirdly, how do you trust? And of course, who do you trust? And finally, I'm going to take a glance at our future. Some people who have seen me present before will know I'm enamored of the small little car that tells you how far down the track that we've got so that you know where we are in the presentation. So first then, let's look at a link and a lesson. This year, I was very honored to present the Donald Broadbent Memorial Lecture at the Chartered Institute for Ergonomics and Human Factors in England, the annual meeting in April. That was a wonderful occasion. And in that presentation, I proposed my own emerging Isles of Autonomy metaphor. This metaphor illustrates the growth and the penetration of nascent autonomous systems. And let me briefly just reprise this here, because there's a twist in the tale that I want to make central to my presentation today. So firstly, let's just deal with what that Isles of Autonomy metaphor is. And it's a series of phased transitions. And in the first transition, what we see is that there's a single island of autonomy, which is surrounded, as it were, by a swathe of human supporters, shown in the illustration at top left as a beach, a form of literal collaboration. And you can see on the right here, the emerging island of autonomy. This is actually Surtsey off the coast of Iceland, but there's that one singular one. And secondly, there's a next phase, and a critical watershed occurs when the discrete autonomous systems begin to link together. And the isthmus between them originally, of course, is composed of human beings or humans. And this is where the autonomy is proceeding from its role as tool to teammate. And in my presentation in England, I illustrated this linking stage, this stage where the two autonomies came together by reference to a recent demonstration. And that demonstration was where Sophia, the robot, you can see here on the left, communicates with Jack, the automated car, and communicates in this case through the human intermediary that you can see. And while sending the file to England, somehow the soundtrack was removed from this particular illustration. I found that rather strange and somewhat disturbing. Had it been excised by some smart autonomous software that sort of hovers in the web looking for things that it wants to rip off? Actually, I have the video at the end here, so we can do retest reliability. For the purposes of completion, I just want to cover the other stages, because I think the next phase transition is that autonomous systems begin to dominate the electronic ecosphere we have, and humans are, in some sense, sequentially squeezed out. And then finally, the final stage is that there are some remaining isles of humanity. They become palimpsestual, residual, deliquescent, and then extinct. And I've talked about this in the article that's referenced there. And if you want any of the references, please feel free to contact me directly. Not a problem to get there. So the problem of the transfer of information raises the question of trust. I trusted that the information that I transmitted would get there, and somehow it didn't. Had my transmitted presentation been autonomously reconfigured? I wasn't quite sure what happens in the web. I'd liked to have believed, I really liked to have believed, it was just simply some technical glitch, but it may nevertheless have been some sort of alteration by a purpose-designed net agent. And we know that these wander about and patrol. In fact, there's an area of artificial intelligence and computer science on patrolling the net. So are there at present any truly autonomous technological systems? This is a conundrum that we have to address in human factors and ergonomics. And until recently, let's say 2020, I would have said personally no, at least not self-intentioned ones. But in reality today, I want to revisit that opinion to see what it is we're now asked to trust. I want to take as a possibility that there are at least autonomous systems of some sort, although whether it attacked my transmission, I'm not sure. So let's start with definitions. We should always start with definitions. And I'm going to begin with my own definitions of an automated system. Automated systems are designed to accomplish a specific set of largely deterministic steps, often in a repeating fashion. We want them to repeat these. We want automated regulation in order to achieve one of a limited set of predefined goals. So automation is somewhat constrained, but that's not particularly constrained as the world goes on. The foundation of autonomy, in contrast, derives from the ontological bases of nomos, meaning a law, and auto, meaning self. And thus autonomous systems are a law unto themselves. And this leads us then on to the definition that I've given of autonomous systems. They are generative, they learn, and they evolve through feedback from operational and contextual information, and their actions necessarily become more indeterminate across time. We are not privy to those learned aspects, and so what the autonomous system does becomes less and less determinate, at least from our perspective. One of the issues that's come up is there any sort of disruptive threshold between these two? Are automated systems necessarily differentiated from autonomous systems? And I've come to believe within the last year to 2 years, there is no singular disruptive threshold, and they merge into one another across time and across capacity. So let's now attack the essence of the problem here. And we're moving along, as you can see, in case you were keeping track, our progress is indexed there. But the essence of the problem is, can you trust your autonomy? Presuming that this autonomy is now beginning to grow, can you trust what it's going to do? And our fiction, science fiction, is redolent with cases where people warn against trusting of this autonomy. And I and some of my colleagues have brought up these ideas of the narrative representing an important effect upon people's belief and thus their trust. And we also have to ask what factors, upon which factors are such trust predicated? In other words, how is it that you trust, and what are the things that affect your level of trust? So let's proceed to that, and some first principles, as it were. Here's a simple diagrammatic representation of trust and the trust agency and trust interaction. So first of all, trust is dynamic. You can see here that there are trust antecedents, things that go before, momentary levels of trust, and then trust sequelae. And so you can see that there's a constant backwards and forwards between trustor and trustee, but it's also a cybernetic process. So in both the predictive and in the retrospective mode, as well as the present encounter, there is constant information being passed backwards and forwards and regulation taking place between trustor and trustee. Now, trust necessarily requires at least two entities, the trustor and the trustee, but it also actually requires that there must be some communication channel between them. If they cannot communicate in a fashion, they're not able to regulate their trust in any way. So trust can be defined as the attitude that an agent will help achieve an individual's goals in a situation characterized by uncertainty and vulnerability. This is the Lee and C paper of 2004, the third most quoted paper in all of human factors, and it's a very well-known paper, and this is an interesting definition, which of course emphasizes risk. It'll come as no surprise to the audience that I rather like this one. Trust is the reliance by an agent that actions prejudicial to their well-being will not be undertaken by influential others. The same emphasis here on risk, but of course this is an agent, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a human being, although right now predominantly it is, although we see trust in animals expressed and discussed and researched quite regularly. So risk and trust exhibit certain contingent relations. I'm not going into details here, but I just want to be able to point out that There are the regions of overtrust and undertrust. And then there are risk-averse people and risk-loving people. And I've shown a simple linear relationship between the two, and then bracketed in this case by some variability, and be able to begin to locate people in the trust-risk space that's illustrated. So how do you trust and who do you trust? Again, moving along, hope we can see we are making ground. So the foundational triad model of trust that my colleagues and I were involved with now more than approximately 10 years ago was one that involved trust in robots. I've come to believe that the entity itself is fairly catholically described. It can be quite large different things. And this triad tends to work on most of them. So I'm going to take it as a template here, as I will do later as well. And what we find that there are human-related factors, and in this case, there are robot-related factors. And of course, there are things about the environment in which the interaction occurs that also influence the individual as they are developing and modifying their trust. But in 2011, by far the most important issue is the reliability of the robot. The perceived and actual reliability of the thing you were interacting with certainly showed the most impactful effects. If you look here, you can see both the correlational and the causal linkages specified by the asterisk and the cross in each section. But my colleagues and I, including some more recent members of my lab, have developed a new model, which is an evolving model for this year, 2021. And you can see it illustrated here, and it's about to be published in a coming issue of Human Factors. And I want to just begin by emphasizing that there are certain commonalities. So there are human factors, you can see them here, but now they've been broken down into, in this case, characteristics and ability-based elements. And we've been able to define and distill those influences that characterized in each one. And here you can see them in the extended petals of the flower, as it were. And for example, you can see that culture is actually an interesting one under characteristics. And so both the size of the boldness of the font and the denotation tells you which are the correlational observations and the causational observations. But of course, we can now go on to what we now call contextual factors, which is the environmental factors, and elaborated to include team collaboration and tasking. These are the ones that are most well experimented on in the present time. And of course, this is an evolving picture, but you can see that, for example, task complexity has a very strong effect in the contextual area. And finally, of course, there are again the robot factors, and I won't belabor the point, but now there are elaborations on what are the factors that affect there. So you can see that the way in which the literature renders, in this case, an interesting picture of how our experimental understanding is developing. And I think we're now moving on to more onto trust dynamics. Now, there is several models of trust, but what I'm going to use here is just a very simple overview. And this the template derives from a mental workload assessment. You can see a reference there. And I believe that the principles are the same principles apply. But this shows that there are a variety of factors that affect, for example, trust level across time. Obviously, the mean and variability of the dynamic signal, you can see characterized in one. What I call the hysteretic qualities, both the prospective qualities labeled here as 3, and the retrospective qualities, that is my history of trust, and on 3, what I anticipate of trusting. Those are influential factors. And 5, the rate of change of the situation that I'm in are also a critical influence on people's decision to trust or not, and their overall level of a state of trust. I'm not going to go through all of these, although all are applicable in some ways, but it's just that to mention that we need to look at more developing dynamic models of trust, and these are coming about. And whom do we trust, and what is this dynamic trust directed at? Who are the things, what are the things that we are being asked to look at? And of course, here it's discussed mostly on terms of automation and autonomy. Now, especially during the pandemic, when people have been confined and corralled, as it were, this has meant more, what you're trusting is the internet and its agents, especially if you have few people in your bubble, as it were. And it's surely here in the internet that any nascent autonomy must presently reside. So if I'm changing my stance in terms of, are there sort of growing, beginning autonomous systems, it is surely in the internet that we begin to see this degree of what we would call autonomy. And I'm asking here today what degree this prospective autonomy is human-centered as opposed to profit-centered. I'm getting more and more interested in trying to understand how human-centered design and profit-centered design sometimes come into great conflict. So to bring this down to cases, I want to bring up some common frustrations. I have these. I hope that you can resonate with them, although I don't find them particularly edifying or pleasant. So I get quite often when I'm interacting with something that's some sort of AI agent, it says, this call is recorded for quality purposes. I hope you can confirm for me there that you see those things. But is it really? Is it indeed? If it's recorded for quality purposes, why do I get the same awful service every time? So clearly it's not recorded for quality purposes, it's recorded for something else. But the AI is telling me something that's manifestly untrue. And then, of course, I begin to distrust. Naturally, it raises in me all sorts of unfortunate questions. I often get phone calls asking me in a mechanical voice how I'm doing today. And I really want to know why there are so many bots concerned with my personal health. I've absolutely no idea. Perhaps they've been programmed to look after me personally. I suspect not. I suspect that's just yet another a misdirection. Let's put it like that and be kind. Try this one. Our menu has changed. Please listen to the following options. Well, it hasn't changed from the last time. What you're really doing is you're downloading your troubleshooting issues to me. But when you lie to me in this obvious fashion, my trust of both you, the individual organization that's telling me this lie, but also in this case, interacting with technology in general, my state of trust, my dynamic state of trust is suppressed by this. These responses that I've illustrated, they're not necessarily autonomy per se. I don't want to say these are autonomous systems, but they are automation, and they're designed to maximize profit at the other end. So imagine what autonomy will do when it's let loose on these sort of environments. So objectively, just how reliable are internet systems with which we presently interact? Harking back to the 2011 findings, if it's reliability that is the main driver, how do I assess the reliability of internet systems? I'm really not sure. What are the measures of such reliability? Is it test, retest reliability? If I did something last time and it does the same thing, am I sort of testing it more? Well, not when it changes quite radically from time to time. Can we as users even begin to distinguish between things that are unintentional failures? My information was thrown out because somebody hacked into it, or was my data intentionally extracted for reasons of profit? And again, if I don't know the difference between those two, then my estimate of reliability and my estimate of trust co-vary accordingly. And so I'm going to do something which I'm sure will sort of annoy Professor Schneiderman, but let's just suppose for a minute that autonomy is a zero sum. Just for a moment, it's a proposition, it's not a certainty. But just in this proposition, machine autonomy waxes and human autonomy then wanes. In such situations, you must be either hammer or anvil. This is a quotation from Longfellow. In this world, man must either be an anvil or the hammer. But it's more precisely clarified, I think, in Goethe. You must either conquer and rule or serve and lose, suffer or triumph. And I think what we're beginning to see here is if there is a global zero sum of autonomy in some fashion, then there must be winners and losers. So are we humans potentially turning from hammer into anvil? Or in another sense, are we morphing from the user to the used? I want to explore that a little bit more, but I believe this is a illustration of the problem that we begin to see in quite a lot of areas of human interaction with technology and beyond, is that local optimization, the ability to locally optimize a system, eventually leads to global dysfunctionality when those systems have to operate together. So the epithets I've heard and have seen, you either use the product or you are the product. Mine particularly is either technology works for you or you work for technology. They're rather bleak contrasts, and I know people will consider them debatable, and certainly they are, but the tendency is that the bifurcation between the two states is beginning to become more and more obvious. Our websites collect data since we are now becoming the commodity itself. I think evidence of this is seen in epithets such as cash for eyeballs, cash for clicks, or thieves of attention, etc., that begin to tell us that we are possibly part of the commodity. And such systems optimize on goals, but they don't consciously do that, not at least in any sense we presently understand. But we have previously seen and been apprised of this eventuality, of this supersession by the technology over the human being. So let's briefly glance back into history for a slide, and we can't say that we've not been warned here. Lo, we have become tools of our tools. This is Henry David Thoreau in 1854, a fair while ago now, more than 150 years, sesquicentennial of Thoreau's pertinent observation. But this is one of my favorites, Samuel Butler in Erewhon. May not man himself become a sort of parasite upon the machine, an affectionate machine tickling aphid. I think here in 1872, Butler is, he's a little acerbic, but he's certainly right on the beam for where we seem to be heading. And one of my favorites is this one. This is a poem of the early 1900s. I have seen the old gods go and the new gods come, day by day and year by year. The idols fall and the idols rise. Today I worship the hammer. And of course, if I'm going to use hammer and anvil, I better acknowledge Carl Sandburg's 1914 poem. So as we see the dangers that are rising and the dangers we've been foretold and the issues and the potential failure of trust, we need to begin and have a look at a glance at our future. So we're beginning to come towards the end here, but I want to look at the future and pose some questions so that these can be subject to debate in our global ergonomics community, because I believe, of course, that ergonomics is a critical element in this discussion. So first, a warning, and the warning is quite simple. Beware, sort of beware what you ask for or what you wish for, because I think once we autonomize, there is no going back. Some people might want to believe in some sort of Arcadian recidivism where we can step back to nature. I know that that's a great common narrative and belief, but I think even a cursory glance at history shows us that this is not going to happen. We can go back to Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, in England at one time, the Luddite movement that tried to smash machinery, or even an example from Australia, Sarah Island, a small island in Macquarie Harbour. And my own a book in 2009 was particularly about Sarah Island and why this idea of going back in technology just simply cannot stand. So I think the proximal challenge that we have in ergonomics is trying to navigate this evolution from automation to autonomy. And that was the subject of my ergonomics paper now some years ago. So what are the limits that we set on autonomy? And more precisely, when do we set these limits? Where do we set them? And how do we set them? We have no agenda for those, even though there's been some suggestions for things like autonomous weapons. We're not seeing the same degree of rational planning for autonomy widely expressed. So what about individual human autonomy in this melange of development? So I think we can ask some questions. How much individual autonomy do we actually possess? That's a very worthwhile and important factors consideration. And I think we should think carefully and answer truthfully about that, and whether we do possess the autonomy that we aspire to and that we put into our fiction, but do we really possess that? Consider, for example, the following. How many times do you see websites accept all the stated terms and click OK to continue? You don't have a choice. There is no choice in here. When the website requires that these fields are filled in, it's much more likely it's a profit-centered motive than a human-centered motive. And in fact, in reality, where is our power here to say no? That's the real question. It's limited at best, but it's diminishing at worst. And there are many dimensions of existence now where you have to sign up for things. Try doing some things in life where you cannot, where you do not sign up. I try, but I'm very unsuccessful at many of these. And as my colleagues will know who help me with such stuff, I rail against them all the time. But to say no is to express distrust. But in reality, at present time, we see that people are leveraged into having to say yes. You don't get a choice. If you wish to have the service or the value derived from the interaction, you have no choice but to give up information to those sites. If autonomy neuters then the effects of distrust, do we trust a social state of rational paranoia? I rather like this idea. Although we may be tempted to conclude that one of my favorite phrases, only the assiduous paranoid finds the true conspiracy. There is no actual conspiracy in that sense. A required monolithic goal is not yet in effect. You have to have a unified purpose in some sense, but rather it's a diffuse and largely unstructured set of local optimization algorithms that presently compete with each other, albeit indirectly. And they focus on non-exclusive and parochial goals. But the question is, what does the future hold? So the big issue here is, but the future has no deterministic necessity or obligation to be a linear extrapolation of the past. In effect, nature and history take right turns occasionally, and there's no reason why they should not be seen to do so. And then the traveling window of generational ignorance. So each generation is born to its own ignorance, and it explores and expresses that ignorance. It's not a purgative appellation. This is not a purgative term. It just is. And so there's a constant reestablishment of new normals. And we've seen that in spades with the pandemic, what a new normal actually means. So the progress of technology and autonomy and automation is often insidious, and it's frequently given insufficient acknowledgement because people are born to the level of the technology that they immediately experience and grow up with. So some things that I, at my time of life, are uncomfortable with, some people who are decades younger have no discomfort with it at all because they've been born to and have grown up with that level of interaction. I want to express one thing before I go, and we should always beware the impact of time. So I've got one little illustration here, and it comes from the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, one of my favorites. Took place in the year 9 in a common interval, a common era, and it was the point at which the high tide of the Roman Empire sort of began to ebb. And it was said afterwards that Caesar of the times sometimes go through his palace at night yelling at a ghost, Publius Quintilius Varus. He actually died there. He was the leader of the Romans. Give me back my legions. So let's look at that in terms of time scale. So 9 in the common era, I've done the calculation, is approximately 1.27 times 10 to the power 12 human perceptual moments ago. Human perceptual moment being about 50 milliseconds. You can look that up in terms of William James and subsequent workers like Popple who talk about the time of the instant moment. But in our current computer speeds, which roughly are 2.3 times 10 to the power 12 themselves, that's half a computational moment ago. Now, I realize, of course, those are cycle times, and it's a general observation to make a point. It's not that it's going to be numerically super accurate. But on a human time scale, when then do we trust in autonomy? When is it effectively expressed? Given that, in this case, half a computational moment ago, potentially, was the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire. We don't remember that. We don't have the experience of that. This is a critical issue of temporal dissonance. And I've raised it repeatedly a number of times, and I've got a new paper coming out in Human-Computer Interaction that's called Avoiding Adverse Autonomous Agent Action. And it's about this particular issue, and one of them is the temporal resonance. With such dissonance, there is no time, perhaps, to either trust or distrust. And so time is a critical issue in human factors and ergonomics that we have to focus much more on. So let me conclude then my speech today with some questions. Could advanced opaque automation already be autonomous? Some years ago, I would have said no. Now I said maybe yes, at least to some degree, and probably to a growing degree, somewhat concerning. Large-scale software systems already seek to optimize upon multiple goals. Okay, well, this makes the unequivocal understanding of their actions exceedingly difficult. Where and when do you stop them to ask questions about their ongoing activity? Extremely problematic. How can we calibrate the trust of such opaque systems? If you don't know what it's doing, what it has done, what it is doing, what it will do, how do you calibrate your trust in how you're going to trust it or not? So that's poor, and it's often irrationally calibrated because we have insufficient information to make the calibration a veridical one. And in profit-driven obligatory use systems, is the user's trust of any inevitable concern? Do they really worry about that anymore? They might worry about the portal entry, but only in a limited and diminishing way. These are the issues that concern me, and I believe in the present gallop towards autonomy that we're choosing the wrong road. It's not a human-centered road. Right now, it's a technology-centered and a profit-centered road. And we need, I think, to recalibrate, rethink, and move in a direction that's a little bit more human-centered, as embraced by our International Ergonomics Association vision statement about the quality of human life. So thank you most kindly for listening to me today. You'll see the car get to the end, but unfortunately it has a crash. And now I'm willing, of course, and should be, to entertain questions from any of the people that would care to do so. So thank you again. I really appreciate the time and the honor of being able to present at the 2021 International Ergonomics Association, albeit virtual. And I thank the organizers for inviting me to do so. Thank you again.